And we know the Sunday school stories. We look at Genesis as like, wow, these are just some of these really big stories that like, how could this be the foundation to the Bible? But it is. It is. It is the entire foundation to the Bible. And that's how I hope that we'll all come into the class being able to see it, right? And you'll be surprised how many questions that you might have that will be answered by Genesis. Like, why is there evil in the world? Why do bad things happen? Why does a good God let bad things happen? Right? The answers are all in Genesis. So this is, the Hebrew name for Genesis. It's a Bereshit, and that means simply beginning. Right? You'll notice that in the book of, if you've ever looked at the Torah, all of the titles of the Torah have to do with the first word, the first sentence, right, in the Bible, and it is Bereshit, which is in the beginning. So we're going to start by looking at reading and interpretation, right? This is the first basics. All you teachers know that, when you're in school, there's a difference between the two, and there's going to be an enormous difference in the reading of Genesis with reading and interpretation. But we're going to begin tonight's class with a little bit of a test for you guys, right? So when you think of the word chemistry, you hear the word chemistry, right? First, I want you to think about what chemistry means in a science book. You probably came up with something that looks like this, very close to that, right? But now I want you to think of what that same word means in a romance novel. And you got something like this. So the same word, right? Different meanings according to what type of book you're reading. Let's try this. Witches. You think of something that's magical realism, right? Got a picture of that? Right. And you might think something like this. I do, at least. Now I want you to think about witches in a history book or historical novel, right? So again, same word, but depending on what you read, right, it's going to have a different meaning to it. I mean, these girls here on the left are not these girls on the right. Now I want you to think of this muffin top. I want you to think of what that looks like in a cookbook, right? It looks something like that, right? Now I want you to think of what muffin top looks like in an exercise book. It looks like that, right? Same word, right? Different meaning. You would not see what you're seeing on your right in a cookbook. That would be like counterproductive. Same word, different meaning depending on what you're reading. So I want you to think about that, right? That's going to be a very, very important thing in Genesis, right? It's a very important concept of what you're going to think about when you read a text in Genesis is not necessarily going to be what it actually means in the text, right? You're going to have to put yourself into we're going to talk about in a bit genre. And this C.S. Lewis quote is a really, really good quote to keep in mind anytime that you read Genesis, anytime you read the Bible, right? The first thing you want to do is to know what it is, right? What it's intended to do and how it's meant to be used. And that's the basis we're going to work this class on. Know what Genesis was intended to do. Because if we sit down and we read Genesis and not know what that intention is, it's going to sound like a lot of stories that could sound very much like fairy tale stories, right? It does not fit into our mode of thinking in the 21st century. So this is what we're going to do in the next few weeks is to look at what Genesis actually is, what it meant to the people who wrote Genesis, right? There's many authors of Genesis down through many, many years, right? It doesn't just get written in one day. It doesn't get written in a month. It's redacted over time. The theology of Genesis is redacted over many, many, many years, up until after the Babylonian exile, when it's answering different questions. And these redactors don't ever really change the structure of, they don't change the meaning of Genesis, but they interpret the theology differently. So it's really important for us to know what the author wants us to know, not what we want to know, but what the author wants us to know and how that author wants us to use it, right? What did the original audience think when they read that? So for everybody who's been a teacher, right, you know that there are two parts to understanding any text, reading and interpretation. So when we read, right, we look at it, we comprehend the meaning of the printed material, we interpret the characters or the symbols, right? That's what reading is about. It is about recognizing the words, understanding kind of what those words mean, and then being able to connect them so that reading becomes accurate and automatic. And the purpose of reading is to understand the words, right, in relationship to one another. But when we read, we just kind of consume literal information. It doesn't tell us what that information means. We can just read it and say, yes, this is a sentence. It doesn't give us any insight into what that text means. For example, right, we can look at these two passages from Genesis and we can read them and we can put these sentences together. But we might not know what these sentences mean, right? These are really difficult sentences. The first one in Genesis 2:2 is one of the most controversial passages in the entire Bible because there's these questions of, well, what does a day mean? How did God do this in 24 hours when we know that scientists tell us, that the earth is millions of years old, right? So just reading that straight doesn't make sense to us. We can read it, but it doesn't give us a real meaning of what Genesis is about. Also, another controversial passage in Genesis. We can read about the snake talking to Eve, but it really doesn't make sense to us, right? That means nothing to us. There's another one. Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt. You're thinking what pillar of salt means. Here we go. Jacob is wrestling with God. How do you wrestle with God? What does that look like? That makes no sense. Reading the Bible makes no sense, right? There has to be something that helps us make sense out of biblical text. That's where interpretation comes in, right? We can't just straight read these. And remember, these texts are written in Hebrew, so things are even a little more complicated. So then we have to look at interpretation. Once we're able to read the text, we need to interpret that text, right? It's explaining that meaning of something. That's to make sense, to make relevancy, meaning, to be able to apply these texts to our lives because that's what they're meant to do. If we don't apply these texts to our lives, right, it means absolutely nothing. We can know what the Bible says, but the goal is to actually live that, right? And so when we look to the interpretation, it helps us to become a critical thinker. And we really have no problem in our lives being able to do that, right? We can pick up a book and we can look at it and we can read the words in English. We can interpret what that text means because that it's usually familiar to us, right? If you've ever read Shakespeare, not always that easy to read Shakespeare, but most texts that we read today are understandable because we understand, like we understand the century, the concepts, the language of where that text is coming from. But when we look at Genesis, we've got different authors from different centuries and millenniums contributing to this text. The first authors of Genesis aren't necessarily the last redactors of Genesis. And again, they're living in different times, and so they're writing for different purposes. They're editing and they're redacting their theology to answer different questions. But if you think about a famous author today, you don't have these complications. They're in your world. But here we don't have that. We have, different language, we have a different culture. And this is really what makes Genesis so tricky, is that we have to be able to understand that culture that Genesis is being written in. And for that purpose. This is a beautiful quote, and I forget who wrote this.
That was then. The world of Genesis was dusty and barely literate. The people of its time were preoccupied with satiating hunger and securing physical safety. They consulted shamans for toothaches, thought that the gods spoke through birth defects and markings on sheep, and they defecated into ditches.
This is now. We are thousands of years removed from the origins of Genesis. We live in a world that has sent people to the moon and back, that uses magnets to map the insides of human bodies. We work and sleep in climate-controlled buildings, travel in air-conditioned cars, fly in pressurized planes, and send text messages through pieces of metal and glass small enough to slip into the pockets of our pants.
So do you see where this is kind of coming from? Reading Genesis is like traveling from downtown Dublin to rural Angola. Context of reader and author could hardly be more different. And this is why through this class, we want to put ourselves back into the time when Genesis was written, because we can't understand that culture. We're not part of that culture. And so much of that culture seems so far removed from where we are today. And yet, the message that's in Genesis still applies to us every single day of our lives. There's something that God is speaking to us through Genesis. It might not answer the issues that people in those days were searching for, right? This is written for a particular audience, but this is why we call God's word living, right? Because it adapts. It adapts to our times. But if we're able to identify what the author was trying to say and how his original audience was understanding it, it will speak to us. So how can we know what something like this means, right? The whole Bible, because we're far removed from the entire Bible. And so this should help you zero in reading all of Scripture, because every Scripture will have an agenda, right? Genesis has an agenda. The author sat down to write this for a reason. Like an epistle, like anything. We know what Paul's epistles. There was a problem in the church. Every time you see an epistle from Paul, you know that there was a problem in the church, and Paul is seeking to answer that problem. We have to understand, that's our job, is to understand what the agenda of the author was. And that's where genre comes in. It's taking similarities in a text, right? The form, the style, the subject matter, and grouping them together. When we talked in the beginning, when we opened up, right, we talked about fashion magazines, we talked about nature, we talked about, magical realism, all genres that have these things in common, whether it's the form, the style, the subject matter, the wording. And the way that we determine genre is by first, right, and most importantly, the author's intent, which we've been talking about. Why is it being written? We've also been talking about, what does the audience expect? Repetitive features, right? Every genre has features that are recognizable from the get-go. And I have some examples here we'll talk about, right? The literary technique, the form, the content, the style, the length, and how it's organized, right? And cultural expectations specific to a time and place. Right? Genres are culturally determined. And when we know the genre of a book, right, it triggers how we read that book. And it triggers our expectations, right? If you know that you're reading a certain book, right? Remember Muffin Top. If you're reading a cookbook, right, and you see that word, it's going to trigger how you expect to read that page, that recipe, right? If you're reading an exercise book, it's going to trigger. That word Muffin Top is going to trigger because you know what your genre is. You're not going to expect to see those blueberry muffins in that, right? It's going to tell you how to think. Genre is going to direct you of how to think. It's going to help you anticipate what you're going to discover in the text and how to apply that information. For example, so when you see these words, once upon a time, get an image in your head, what you're going to think. You're probably thinking something like this, right?
Yeah.
Fairy tale.
A fairy tale, right? You're going to think a fairy tale. You're going to think when you see those words, I'm going to have a fairy tale, your expectations are being directed already, right? And you're going to think your expectations are going to trigger your reading so much, you even know how it ends, right? You're going to think that and then it's happily ever after. Because you know your genre and you know what elements go into that genre. And mostly everything that begins with once upon a time is basically going to end like that. Because if you hear once upon a time, you're not going to think this, right? You're not going to think a horror story.
Chucky.
With Chucky, right? You're not going to, if you open a book that says once upon a time, you're not going to think that Chucky's going to be in it. You're already thinking fairy tale. The butler did it. You're going to think mystery, right? Because your brain is triggered. It knows that that's what's in that genre. You're not going to think this. You're not going to think science fiction. That's just wrong because your expectations are already set before you get into that book. So this beautiful thing, Robert Alter is a wonderful, wonderful biblical scholar.
Every culture, even every era in a particular culture, develops distinct and sometimes intricate codes for telling its story.
Yeah. So what are our ways to tell a story? That once upon a time in fairy tales doesn't mean that that was somebody 300 years ago, right? A culture's 300 years ago to tell that story. And this is how it is for our biblical authors, right? They don't tell stories the way that we do today. They have their own distinct codes for telling a story. And this is what we see in Genesis. So when you see once upon a time, right, you're not going to think of that talking snake or Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt because Genesis has its own way of telling its story. We can't interpret these stories in Genesis unless we know all about the culture it was written. And so sometimes when you open up the Bible, and especially Genesis, as we're going to see in a few minutes, like, why is Genesis so controversial? Because people aren't reading it in the culture that it was written. When we ignore that genre, we start to misrepresent the text, purpose, and meaning. For example, one of the most controversial passages in the entire Bible, Genesis 1, is like so controversial. There's been so many fights between the scientific world and the biblical world about this, and people get stuck in the middle, right? Because we do this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and immediately our 21st century minds think this. Well, how did God do that if that's what science tells us it looked like? As soon as we see this, we start to think, well, wait, that doesn't make sense because if this is what science tells us, how in the world does God create this? That wasn't around there. Now we know, right? We're so enlightened now. And then we see this other controversial passage about God making man, from the dust in the ground. And we're like, that's crazy. That's just crazy because our minds have been taught to think this. And that doesn't match that, does it? And yeah, we have scientific evidence that says this is true. So this, what do we do with that? We start to categorize it like this. We start to say this on the left is science and this over here must be theology, right? We start to read the Bible through scientific eyes and we start to question theology through this, right? We do this because we're reading it through 21st century eyes. And then all of these questions start, right? We just start flooding all these questions. Then once we have categorized the Bible as science, literal science, right? Our minds go crazy and we start to ask all this. And especially this. This is the big one, right? Gonna snake talk. As a youth educator, like doing Bible studies with people through the years, this is always the big sticking point. Well, the snake talks. Snakes don't do that in real life. Science knows that snakes don't talk because we're looking at that passage through our 21st century eyes. And we know that snakes don't talk, right? And the next thing you know, you get something like this. And that's the reaction of most people today, is that it kind of makes you an unbeliever. It's very important to remember that it can't be different. That meaning cannot be different. The text can't be different from what the author and the original audience meant it to be. But there was a scholar at one time who just did not believe that that the Old Testament God, right, that Yahweh could possibly be Jesus's father, because he was just so cruel and he was so without love and forgiveness that his whole idea was just scrap the entire Old Testament, right? Because it could not possibly be who Jesus is talking about. I'm hoping that through this course we can soften that up because this is really going to explain so much of who that God is, right? To help you see that God of the New Testament is absolutely positive that it is the God of the Old Testament, right? And that's wonderful because most people will just skip over it. It just fits into our thinking, right? The New Testament is so much easier to swallow. Or there's a lot of stuff in the New Testament that is not easy to swallow. And certainly yesterday's gospel, right? I talked to one of our parishioners that was there yesterday and said that gospel yesterday is one of the gospels that I don't like the least. Like I skipped that one because I don't understand how Christ could say, cut off your arm, gouge out your eye. But when you say that it's hyperbole, exaggerated hyperbole, that was actually, a rhetorical device that goes all the way back, to the Old Testament, that people use this hyperbole, especially rabbis, to grab the attention of their audience. But then, yeah, it makes sense. It doesn't make Jesus sound weird anymore. When Jesus says, to follow me, you've got to hate your parents. Well, certainly, Lori, you're not going to start hating Linda. You're not going to start all hating your parents, right? Because it's this hyperbole to grab your attention, right? And this is what we're going to see in Genesis. There's different genres, there's different rhetorical devices that are going to be used that are going to tell this story. Again, go back to what Robert Alter says, right? Is that every culture has different ways of telling its story. And that's what we're going to see in Genesis. And this is a really important thing to remember, right? That the Bible was written for us, not to us.
As an ancient text, Genesis is firmly rooted in the worldview of its time, so cannot be judged on the basis of modern historical inquiry and scientific precision that ancient people were not at all aware of.
Genesis answers questions that were specific to Israel at that time. And we'll see why. In the next class, we'll start to say what was going on in this world when this book was written. Or we'll talk about the redactions. But Genesis addresses issues that are happening in its own world. Now, that doesn't mean to say it's not pertinent to our world. And when we get to that point, we will talk about, how this is pertinent to our world today. But this is extremely important as we move forward to remember. It cannot be judged by where we stand today.
It is not likely that God would have allowed his word to come to the ancient Israelites according to standards they understood. And so, no, Genesis doesn't answer all those questions. Our 21st century inquiring minds want to know because it wasn't meant to.
You're not going to find, Genesis is not going to answer the questions that are on our minds today, but that doesn't mean that Genesis isn't valuable in our lives today, right? written for Israel, but still speaks to us today. And we'll talk about the ways that it does, right? So here is one of your purposes, right? It was meant to redirect its audiences back to God. That's called emic understanding, right? When we go into the thought world of the author, right, it's called emic understanding. And we're able to see more clearly what Genesis was and what Genesis wasn't. And when we understand what Genesis was meant to be and what it wasn't meant to be, right, we're able to understand the text and how to apply it in our lives today. Right? What Genesis was and what Genesis wasn't. What Genesis wasn't an apologetic. It's a defense of Christian beliefs, right? Not an apology. It's a defense of. Was it meant to be a defense against modern science? When it's written, they had no idea about modern science. They weren't talking about it. And it is not meant to defend it, right? We tend to think that today because we put Genesis on the defense because it doesn't match our scientific understanding. It's not meant to, right? That's not what it's about. It's not about saying, yes, there were humans and not evolution. So what Genesis was a polemic. Yeah, so a polemic is literature. At the bottom, you can see the definition, right? It's used to dispute opponents. So an apologetic defends somebody's faith, and a polemic finds fault with others' beliefs. See the difference? One is a defense, one is more of an offense. And Genesis is written as this polemic. And it's written against the pagan worldviews, particularly polytheism, many gods, right? And the ancient Near East accounts of primeval history that threaten to influence and pervert God's chosen Israel.